for having me. So the first thing that I gotta say, and half the people here are not gonna believe me, and the other half will never change. But we are Monroe Lake, not Lake Monroe. Cannot even convince the people who live here of that. But I'm gonna work on it. Keep working on it. This is Monroe Lake, and I've been the naturalist here at Monroe Lake since 2011. Prior to that, I was at Springmill State Park for about 5.5 years, and spent 2 years at McCormick Creek State Park. So I've been bouncing around at all the local parks, done all of them except for Brown County at this point. So again, thank you very much for having me. And I'm here to talk to you a bit about the history of this reservoir that your conference is at, and tell you a bit about how this came to be. This is one of those subjects that I get really, really into. And there's a number of subjects that I get really, really into that bore people to death. So hopefully, you guys have some relevant interest to this, and you're going to get into this with me, and I think this stuff is pretty cool too, on the history of how our reservoir came to be. So the story of how Monroe Reservoir was built winds around almost as much as Salt Creek itself does. See if my clicker's working? Yes. So the way this started out is we have these fluctuations between extreme flooding and low flow in Salt Creek. And they've been viewed as problematic since probably starting around the 1820s, which was when white settlers first started to move into this area and started to have kind of a settled, established presence here. The first wave of those people that came in largely settled in the hills. They cleared small hilltop areas. These are subsistence farmers, and they avoided these Salt Creek bottomlands. Let's see, I think I have a laser here. Oh, I'm pointing at the ceiling. Oh, I cannot, apparently, the TV does not acknowledge this laser light is real. But the areas marked in yellow, I don't know if you can see those, but they're labeled swampland there on the map. And so people avoided these areas. They considered them to be worthless, disease-ridden. Why would anyone want to, set up a house there or do anything down there? But as more and more people started to come into this area, these so-called swamplands started to kind of be settled out of necessity. They're just kind of running out of good farmland. And when people actually started settling in these areas, what they discovered is that these worthless pieces of bottomland were not actually all that worthless after all, and that the soil that was collecting down in these floodplains actually made for pretty rich farmland. So just kind of flipping back between these two maps, you can see that by this is 1856, we still have a lot of swampland that has been unsettled and unclaimed. And the next comparison map I have here is 1928. But if I pulled like the 1875, you would see everything had been settled by then. But what's also marked on here, you can see some improvements in mapping capability. And where Salt Creek actually flows gets mapped a little bit more precisely over the years. But the Salt Creek watershed consists of about 647 square miles. So we encompass the majority of Brown County, just the southeastern portion of Monroe County. Monroe County likes to claim this lake, but we are really tied in almost every way that matters, except perhaps politically, to Brown County, not to Monroe. We also have a significant section in northwestern Jackson County, and then some little teeny pieces in Bartholomew and Lawrence County. So we're pretty sprawling. The main Salt Creek, is running for a total of 58.2 miles. And it was once carrying the meltwater that was flowing down off the glaciers during the Illinoisan and the Wisconsin glacial stages. That meltwater resulted in a flow that was significantly higher than the amount of water that's flowing down through the creek today, carved our valley both wide and deep. And that, in places, the original valley floor was actually cut 65 feet lower down than what it is today. And then it subsequently got filled back in by post-glacial sediment and alluvium that the glaciers were also sending off of them. So glaciers carved it out with the water, then they filled it in with all the rock and sediment that they had been carrying down as those glaciers melted away. Now, in addition to glacial material, primary source of the sediment that is filling the valley came and still comes from all the tributaries that are flowing into Salt Creek. This is where it gets kind of interesting for when we talk about soil conservation and relevant issues in reservoir planning. Salt Creek, the main creek, has a slope drop of only about 2 feet per mile, okay, not significant. But the tributaries that flow into it have gradients up to 30 feet per mile. And that creates very favorable conditions for erosion. And adding to that, when we look at the bedrock that underlies this area, and if you want to know more about rocks, please come talk to me. I love talking about rocks. They make their way into every presentation I do somehow, because everything comes back to the bedrock that this area is built on, and any area you're in is built on. So I love talking rocks. But our bedrock is mostly siltstone and sandstone. People think of this area, the state area, the country, they think limestone. That is not what we have in southeastern Monroe County. We have siltstone and sandstone, and that's going to be very relevant to us because these rock layers are pretty much impermeable to water. So they block subsurface absorption. They force most of the water, the rain that falls in this area, to rapidly collect and then consolidate in surface streams rather than going subsurface like they do in limestone areas. So because of this, extreme flooding can occur from what would be classed generally as like a moderate rainfall. So when we have rain, when we have some heavy rain in the Salt Creek region, what we do is we kind of hit above our weight class when it comes to the flooding that we generate. And this is a photo from the 1930s of some of the floodwaters in the bottomlands. I have all kinds of these photos from the 1920s and 1930s. Flooding was a fact of life. It was extremely common, happened every year, and the residents who lived in the Salt Creek Valley area were used to it, used to working around it and dealing with it. So where does that water go once it's collecting in Salt Creek? Well, it sends the water and perhaps even more significantly the silt that water is carrying with it, sends all of that stuff rapidly downstream. It ends up flowing then into the East Fork of the White River and then on from there into the mighty Wabash. I keep having the balance. So I don't usually use a mic when I talk. I'm usually just used to screaming everything I say because I never have magnification. This is like a weird balancing act for me, holding this and trying not to scream into the mic because I'm used to projecting my voice. But when we have storm events that occur over this broader region, we get this outsized water contribution from Salt Creek that becomes a critical driver of larger scale flood events that are destroying farmlands, they're washing away homes, interrupting river commerce. And the worst pre-flood or pre-reservoir flooding event that we have that has solid documentation for it occurred in 1913. 8.4 inches of rain fell between March 23rd and 27th of that year, and Salt Creek hit high water marks of 569.3 feet elevation along its North Fork by Belmont, which is in Brown County, and then 521.3 feet downstream in Harrodsburg, which is just a bit further downstream than where we are in the valley right now. So the water flow in the creek at the location where the dam now sits is estimated to have been flowing through in 1913 at a rate of 27,000 cubic feet per second. It crested at 40.2 feet on March 27th of that year. I don't know how much, I'm guessing most of you all have a kind of a pretty reasonable idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about when we say these cubic feet per second, but it gets more impressive when you translate it into gallons. And that 37,000 cubic feet per second, that's 276,779 gallons of water crossing that mark every single second. So that's a lot of water. And the entire Wabash River basin ended up being impacted by this flood event. It wasn't just the White River tributary. And in places, the Wabash River actually grew to nearly 7 miles in width across. And it was in the aftermath of this 1913 flood that Indiana then established its first flood control commission. We had another large-scale flood in the White River Basin. This was in January of 1937. The 1937 flood was not as big, at least here locally, as the 1913 flood, but we hear people talk about famous floods in Indiana. The 37 flood, particularly down the Ohio River, is the one that people talk about a lot. Within Salt Creek, that flood crested on January 15th of 37 at 19,700 CFS, with a secondary crest on January 22nd at 16.8 thousand CFS. We had other pre-reservoir floods in Salt Creek that contributed to the more wider flooding in the White River Basin. 1847, 1856, 1866, 1875, and 1950. And what I find really interesting is that there are limited surviving accounts, but there was a flood event in 1828 that might have actually exceeded the size of that 1913 flood. There just weren't very many people around to document it and report on it, and very few newspapers to record that happening. So it's just like some random diary entries and reports like that that have kind of filtered through. Major flooding events almost always are occurring here in the winter and the spring. That's where they're kicking off. The storms during that time of year, they tend to occur because you have a warm front colliding with a cold front. When warm air is less dense than cold air, so it rises, moves over the top of the cold air then cools down the warm air, and that produces tons and tons of rain-filled clouds. We call these cyclonic storms because they're occurring over a large area, and they have heavy amounts of rain associated with them. Whereas the summer storms, which are just kind of finally moving out of that period now, these are typically convective instead. The sun is shining down, it's heating up a shallow layer of air right next to the ground. Warm air rises up into the atmosphere, cools down, turns from gas into liquid, rains back down. And so convective storms tend to be much more localized. So these are our summer pop-ups. You never quite know when they're gonna pop up. But they're there, they go away, usually in a fairly short time, rarely result in or drive flooding events. Rainfall, of course, during the summer is also less likely to cause flooding for other reasons. So the ground isn't frozen. So you have frozen ground, you're gonna have even more runoff when the ground is frozen because it can't absorb anything really. You have evaporation occurring more rapidly in the summer. Temperatures are warmer. And also the plants, of course, play a big role in the summer months. They're available to actually uptake some of that water that's flowing down. Plants are dormant during the winter. There's nothing to uptake any of that extra water. And so what does that lead to within Salt Creek? Now, if this TV acknowledged the existence of my light, I would point to some of these numbers. But what did we get then? And hopefully, I don't know how well you can read them in the back, little small numbers. But our highest flow typically occurs January to March, lowest flow to August to October. Prior to construction of the reservoir, the water flow in Salt Creek during those low periods would sometimes drop all the way to zero. Basically, we had no flow going at all. So huge contrasts. And as with flooding, extreme low flow in Salt Creek also has downstream implications for these larger rivers. So shallow areas are going to emerge that can bring commercial river traffic to a halt. Businesses that are trying to draw water out start to draw silt out instead. So they may have to shut down, day-to-day operations. When we think of it from a more modern perspective, I get this from both ends, from tourists. People are not happy when we have too much water, and they're also not happy when we have too little water. There are impacts on recreation and tourism in both of those directions. And it was this boom or bust cycle then that led the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to complete their first comprehensive study of the Wabash River Basin as a whole in 1928. But at that time, they took a look at it, and they decided not to do anything. As you see in the quote there, is not flood control or irrigation or any combination thereof, blah, 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 is not deemed advisable at the present time. So nothing happened yet. Following the major flood, though, of 1937, which impacted the entire Ohio River Valley basin, we had a record discharge of 1.95 million CFS from the Ohio into the Mississippi River. I did not calculate that out as gallons, but it's a lot. And so the Corps goes back and after this 37 flood and says, maybe we should take a look at this again. And they recommended then that 45 reservoirs be constructed along the Ohio River tributaries to help mitigate future flood damage. And that was including 8 reservoirs that they were looking at building within the Wabash River Basin. This slide, I want some credit for because this individual slide took me 4 hours. I told you I get obsessed with things. I had this list of reservoirs, but no locations for them. Trying to track down what the heck they were talking about in these reports with very little information. A couple of them were obvious, a couple of them I knew, but holy cow, trying to track some of these locations down. It's like they don't even call them by like the same names all the time nowadays. So I'm very, very proud of this map. I'm gonna trip on something here. It's stuck to my shoe, that's why. I'm also used to walking around a lot, and I used to being tethered. But these were the 8 reservoirs in the Wabash River Valley, so 2 in Illinois, and the remainder on the Indiana side. And you'll notice, you can see, if you look really closely, there's where Monroe Lake ends up, but you'll notice that we were not one of the original ones proposed in this. 1944, there's a report by the Corps' Louisville District, and this is the first time that we get Salt Creek actually be mentioned specifically as a potential place where they might be able to do something about water flowing into the Wabash. But they said, maybe we do something, heck if we know what it is, because nobody, again, mentioned the possibility of building a reservoir here. That did not come up as a potential option until 1946, is the first mention of a reservoir in the Salt Creek Basin. And it is, it's not the Corps who suggested it. It's actually a professor named Owen Foster from Indiana University's School of Education. And he could care less about flood control. That was not on his mind. What was worrying him was the municipal water supply. Bloomington, this is population growth by the decade. And here we, 1930, 1940, 1950, we had this exponential population growth going on here. And Professor Foster was looking at the water supply, and the other city officials were looking at the water supply, and they're like, this is going to be a problem. We are going to run out of water to get to this growing population. And so Professor Foster suggests to the Indiana Flood Control and Water Resources Commission that a reservoir be constructed approximately in the area of that red circle, which would mean a whole lot more to you if you were actually from this area and knew where that red circle was. It's in Monroe County, it's in the Salt Creek Basin there. Suggested this is a site about 2 miles downstream from State Road 46. That helps anybody locate it. Commission took a look at his proposal, says that looks interesting, and then nothing happens. Nobody moves for it. We go forward a bit to the summer of 1947, and the proposal resurfaces in 47 with a bit of a modified focus. Our governor at the time was that gentleman down there in the left corner. That's Ralph Gates. And he suggested that the commission get together with the Corps and examine the possibility of using a reservoir on Salt Creek for flood control. And so commission staff members, they get together, they meet with the Corps, and they come up with this recommendation that if we are going to, if we are going to build a reservoir, we should put it down near the lower part of the stream, so as close as we can to the outlet of Salt Creek so that they could get maximum flood control benefits from it. So the commission continues to pursue the idea through the end of the governor's term. And there's a report then that they issue in January of 49, which stated that, quote, the Salt Creek survey can be highly recommended